The Montana Freemen were a Christian Patriot movement based outside the town of Jordan, Montana. The members of the group referred to their land as Justice Township, and had declared themselves no longer under the authority of any outside government. They became the center of public attention in 1996 when they engaged in a prolonged armed standoff with agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Philosophy. The Montana Freemen espoused belief in the doctrine of individual sovereignty and rejected the authority of the federal government of the United States. Leon's leader Leroy Schweitzer and the Freemen used inter alia Anderson on the Uniform Commercial Code and Banker's Handbook to draw notices of lien against public officials. The liens were then allegedly sold to generate equity to fund an effort to make a firm offer to pay off the national debt. The Freemen claimed that the liens conformed to the Uniform Commercial Code, and that their township's court had an interest in a tort claim for damages incurred by the named public officials for violations of their oaths of office. They viewed support of the corporate credit system as an unconstitutional act which would incrementally deprive the people of their property, until their posterity wakes up homeless. A paraphrased quotation attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Bank fraud. The Freemen were known to produce their own very realistic counterfeit checks and money orders, sometimes ordering items and deliberately overpaying so they could demand refunds. The president of one bank reported that over an 18-month period his bank received 2 to 5 complaints a week about Freeman checks. In 1995, members wrote a fraudulent check to try to purchase $1.4 million worth of firearms, ammunition, and bulletproof vests. Standoff. In late 1994, foreclosure proceedings were initiated against the farm that contained Justice Township. The Freemen refused to be evicted from the land. They had also conducted their own mock trials of numerous public officials, and issued their own writ of execution against a federal judge. The FBI investigated the group and initiated a sting operation aimed at one of the Freemen's financial programs, which led to the arrest of 2 members of the group in March 1996. The FBI also had warrants for 8 other persons suspected to be in the farm, but before they were able to arrest them, an armed confrontation developed and the FBI withdrew to a safe distance to avoid violence. The similar 1993 standoff in Waco, Texas involving the Branch Davidians, as well as the 1992 incident between the Weaver family and the FBI at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, were still fresh in the public mind, and the FBI was extremely cautious and wanted to prevent a recurrence of those violent events. After 81 days of negotiations, the Freemen surrendered to authorities on June 14, 1996. Aftermath. Statutes were subsequently changed in Montana, and eventually elsewhere, to require that any notices of liens filed had to have a current county judge or clerk's signature to be held valid as commercial paper, which can be sold or traded. Leroy Schweitzer was convicted of conspiracy, bank fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, false claims to the IRS, interstate transportation of stolen property, threats against public officials, armed robbery of a television news crew, and firearms violations. He received a 22-year sentence for 25 convictions in a South Carolina federal prison, but was moved to the administrative maximum facility at the Florence Federal Correctional Complex at Florence, Colorado. In 2006, after Irvin Elbert Hurlburt and Donald Little, who identified themselves as Montana Marshals, attempted to free Schweitzer from the prison, he died, aged 73, in the ADX on September 20, 2011. Members have contended in various shortwave and talk radio interviews that several of the liens were sold into the offshore banking market. Some members and members of their families have claimed that the U.S. government's tactics were used to coerce Schweitzer and others to release the liens on public officials. Scott Roeder, convicted for the 2009 murder of Dr. George Tiller, was reportedly involved with the Freemen. Members of the Montana Freemen and their sentences. Leroy Schweitzer, 22 years, died in federal prison on 20 September 2011 of natural causes, at age 73 years. Emmett Clark, time served plus 3 years under supervision. Richard Clark, 12 years. James Hans, 5 years, 7 months. Levon T. Hansen, 1 year, 1 day. Dana Dudley Landers, 1 year, 9 months with credit for 2 years and 3 months already served. Russell Dean Landers, 11 years, 3 months, and see below. Daniel Lee Peterson, 15 years, and see below. On 7 April 2008, Russell Dean Landers had his sentence extended by 15 years for attempting to extort his release from prison. He and 2 other inmates at the federal prison in El Reno, Oklahoma had demanded millions of dollars from officials for the use of their names, which they claimed were copyrighted. They were found guilty of conspiring to impede the duties of federal prison officials and extortion in efforts to gain release from prison by making financial demands on prison staff and attempting to seize their property. On 6 April 2010, Daniel Lee Peterson was sentenced to additional time for filing bogus liens from prison against 3 federal judges. One of the judges targeted was the judge who sentenced Peterson to prison originally. Peterson was sentenced in 1996 to 15 years. He was convicted on 19 of 20 counts, which included bank fraud and armed robbery. While serving his sentence in a federal prison in Minnesota, Peterson devised a scheme in which to retaliate against 3 judges in his case. Federal prosecutors, after investigating, found that Peterson invented a company that supposedly held assets that included a $100 trillion default judgment against the United States. He then sold shares of the phony company to fellow inmates and others. He claimed these shares were backed by redemption certificates, to be redeemed when the judgment was collected. The judgment he referred to came from a self-created court, after former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright declined to respond to his demands. He was demanding $100 trillion, as well as $1 billion per day in interest for unlawfully confining him. Peterson followed up by filing liens against property owned by the 3 federal judges, as well as offering bounties for the arrest of the same judges. The purpose was to entice someone to bring the 3 judges to Minnesota, in order to respond to his liens. A 2011 National Public Radio report claimed that some of the people associated with this case were imprisoned in a highly restrictive communication management unit.